Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed lunch, and thanks for joining us. So my name is Pieter Kemps, and I manage our relationships with the venture capital and startup community across Asia Pacific for Amazon Web Services. Now, I'm not going to talk about Amazon Web Services today, or not really, but very much around what the introduction was saying, startup DNA, and how that's important and why that's important. I think what's interesting, if you think about the whole customer discovery process, and when I speak with startups, they always focus just on that beginning, right? Customer discovery, customer validation, and there's very, very little focus on company building, which is actually a very fundamental part, and that is pretty important. And if you listen to Steve Blank, he often, when he talks about company building, he talks about the Shakespearean tragedy, and he talks about the fact that there's a lot of founders that actually build their companies and are great at the startup and the early stages, but then the culture changes in the organization and they might not do that well and they might get ousted out by their investors or by other people. And he talks about how that's actually a really painful experience and happens a lot, and there's a lot of examples of that. And yet, there's a lot of successful founders that have maintained with their business all the way up to scale and to really large, successful businesses. So Brian Chesky, Airbnb, Aaron Levy, Box, or the old guard, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and so on. So, talking about Airbnb, if you zoom into those guys, they're obviously a lot more at scale. And what was mentioned in the introduction was now that there was this interesting blog post that appeared. And it was actually when Peter Thiel was doing Series D with Airbnb and start looking at their metrics. And that was end of 2013. And in the beginning of the year, they had about 4 million Airbnb guests. That grew very quickly to about 9 million. So that's a massive growth. And they're a customer of Amazon Web Services. And if you look at those metrics, we've seen them grow like really rapidly on the services that they're using on our side, on compute and storage and all that. So it was actually then that Brian asked Peter, like, what is the single most important piece of advice for us? And I wanted to be more polite, so I said that his answer was don't mess up the culture. But yes, it was actually what was said earlier. And that actually spurred Brian Chesky to really think about culture, and not just what they were already doing, but also how he articulated that to his internal teams and to the business. And internally, it started with an internal note, but he then recently wrote this blog post. And one of the things he said there is that culture is what creates the foundation for all future innovation. And if you break the culture, you break the machine that creates your products. It's great saying it. It's kind of like copycatting something that Phil Libin, the founder of Evernote, said about a year earlier, where he said that the product is the product, but culture is the next 100 products, right? So I think that kind of like establishes the importance of that, but how do you do that? How do you keep that startup DNA as you grow? And there's a lot of like large companies out there that obviously were, very agile in the beginning, were driving a lot of innovation, but when they got to scale, it was all red tape, bureaucracy, and so on. So how do you build startup DNA into your culture as you scale up your business? And I was chatting with a couple of folks around this, and initially we're planning to talk very much about just startup culture at scale and talk about Amazon. But one of the key questions I got from several people was, how do you actually think about that as you scale your business, as you grow? When do you start thinking about that? And that was actually great feedback. So I thought about taking that line of thinking and first look at what is the role of culture when you start your company, when you're in the early days. So let's look at a company here from Philippines. They presented at Echelon in previous years called Payroll Hero. So they were facing a problem that a lot of startups are facing, and that's finding people, right? It's really hard to find people. And as part of my role, I actually work with a lot of startups on their fundraising. And there's a lot of focus on the investor pitch deck. But if you think about it, that should be maybe the third pitch deck you work on. The first one should obviously be customers, right? And how do you show value to customers. But something that no one ever does, except for these guys, is actually think about your employee pitch deck. If you're a startup and it's very risky for successful talent to join you, you want to be able to articulate why they should be joining you. And a lot of that has to do with your DNA and with your culture. So what Payroll did is they realized that, and they started looking at their existing values. It's two Canadian guys that moved to the Philippines, that were traveling a lot, that really liked adventure, that were joining from bigger companies, a startup, and they had this concept of living in the stretch. And they started really thinking about this and thinking about the fact that they'd been not successful in hiring the right people. They were obviously not offering big paychecks and so on, but they did offer something else, right? Flexible schedules, a lot of travel, adventure, They opened up offices not just in Manila, but also in Whistler, close to Vancouver, in a big ski resort. And they created this concept. They looked at these values and created this concept of adventure engineering. So they really think about it as not building something that wasn't there. Those values were there, but they validated them. They codified them into a term that they called adventure engineering. And they started really looking at culture as an asset. And culture as something that they can talk to and talk through when they were trying to hire talent. So I think many of us are familiar with the acronym ABC, always be closing, in the sales context. These guys are actually thinking about ABH, always be hiring, and really looking at, again, culture as an asset. So Mike Stevenson, their founder, has this employee pitch deck on his mobile phone, and it talks about what they're doing, what they're about, what their culture is, what challenges they're working on, and he actually uses that a lot in random situations. And one of the best stories I heard is one of their guys was going snowboarding in Whistler and was fitting on boots in a ski shop. And the guy that was helping him had a Ruby on Rails t-shirt. So he was like, you're in a ski shop, you're wearing Ruby on Rails, what's the story? Well, I'm actually a developer, I worked many years in the Valley, and I kind of like want to do more snowboarding, so I quit that, and I'm just working this job so I can do a lot of snowboarding. So they actually invited him into the office, did some pair engineering, gave him some assignments, and the guy was kick-ass. So they actually hired him. So now the guy is still like snowboarding, but working really hard. So it's not just lifestyle. It's very much around, they work around Scrum sprints, and they have clear tasks, and you can't do just what you want. You get your stuff done, but when it's done, you're flexible working hours, and you can go snowboarding, or you can go hiking in the jungle or whatever. So I think it's really, really interesting to look at that. And Vinod Khosla said that a company becomes the people it hires, not what it plans. And that's really what, in this case, their thinking about culture is about. Jeff Bezos at Amazon has something to say about that as well. Let's see what he says.
But when you attract people who have the DNA of pioneers and the DNA of explorers, you build a company of like-minded people who want to invent. And that's what they think about when they get up in the morning. How are we going to work backwards from customers and build a great service or a great product?
So again, that focus on hiring the right people and make sure that they fit into your culture and drive that forward. So that's like at the early days, right? And I think Payroll Hero is a good example of a company that starts figuring out who they are and what they're about and what their identity is, and then codify that and find ways to talk about that. Now, when you start scaling, and when you're at a different level, and obviously Airbnb in terms of its size and its revenue and its amount of funding is at a next stage of its evolution, if you like. It's not just about your culture, but it's how you turn that culture into something that makes people as successful as they can be. And Mike Curtis, the VP of Engineering at Airbnb, mentioned that good culture is about creating an environment where people do their best work. So if you think about that part around creating an environment, how do you do that? So now you have to start listening to your culture and looking at it, but turning it into the right structure and the right organization and the right processes to allow people to be successful. So there's a couple of examples of that. So if you look at their organization, for example, they really have this mindset of structured teams, but fluid responsibilities. In their culture, a lot is around sharing, collaboration, sharing of information very openly and freely and so on. But in the organization, they got very, very structured teams. These teams are all small, contained teams, no more than 10 people. They're all cross-functional. They have data scientists. They have engineers, obviously. They have designers in there. And they all have end-to-end responsibility for the product or feature that they work on. And an example is, in Airbnb, you have hosts and guests, right? You've got the host, and on the other side, you have the guests. Within Airbnb, they realize that the demographics of those and the characteristics of those are different, and the value proposition that Airbnb offers is different. So they're like distinct teams. Having said that, they also realize that a key value proposition of Airbnb is that interaction between hosts and guests. So they're structured teams, but they have very close relationships around sharing of roadmaps, sharing of goals, working on projects together, and so on. So I think it's a great example of how they listen to that culture of collaboration and then turn that into the structure in which they work, and they're trying to be successful. Another part is process. And an example of that is their code review process. So initially, in the smaller organizations, specifically ones that are really agile and use continuous integration and deployment and so on, you can put code into production very, very quickly. But when you get bigger and there's more interdependencies, it becomes a bit harder. So for a long time, they had the ability to do pull requests and ask for code reviews by peers. But it wasn't like told that they had to do it, so no one really did it. But then a few very motivated engineers started taking that more seriously and started doing it. And they got great outcomes. Their code improved a lot. They got more successful. So they basically said, hey, why don't we share that with other people, how valuable these pull requests are and that peer review is. And automatically, again, the culture of collaboration made it into something that really became a process that then everyone started using. And they also started looking not just at the process, but also what does it mean to our architecture and tooling, and how can we make it easier for people to actually follow that process. And they started creating this bookmarklet that's on GitHub and basically make sure that it became easier to do continuous integration around that workflow that included those peer reviews. So again, culture is then looked at in the context of your organization and your processes to actually capture that startup DNA and make them successful. Now, when you're at scale, it's a bit of a different story. And that's obviously, if you look at Amazon.com and where we are as an organization, it's a bit different again than Airbnb. And in many ways, Amazon is still a very tech-driven and geeky company. So when they were asking about, like, what is it in your culture that drives innovation and that drives your identity, one of the engineers actually captured it in a function. So he basically said, innovation at Amazon is a function of organization times architecture to the power of mechanisms times culture. Now, that's indeed a bit quirky and a bit gimmicky and don't really take the formula that seriously, but the key components are, I think, very important. And if you think about the examples I've spoken about so far, the culture part that I talked about in payroll, the mechanisms or processes and the organization that I spoke about at Airbnb, they're all pretty fundamental. And when you talk about culture, culture at Amazon, we really feel it's the most powerful thing in driving the speed of innovation that we're trying to offer. Not just across Amazon Web Services, but across Amazon as a whole. And when you talk culture at Amazon, it's all about the leadership principles. And obviously, culture in an organization like Amazon and any organization evolves, but right now, the culture is captured by these leadership principles. And I worked in a lot of organizations where you have these values or mission statements on your badge, and even though you carry them with you all day, you haven't got a clue what they're saying, it doesn't really resonate with you. That's what I found really different in Amazon. So I don't have them on my badge at all, and yet everyone lives them. So what you see with values in a lot of companies is that they're aspirational. We want to be this or we want to be that. What you see in Amazon is they're very much descriptive, or like describing what the actual behaviors is and what the organization is actually about. So that's a big difference. It's also a big difference that it's not top down, but bottom up as well. So a lot of people in their day-to-day communication, they use these leadership principles as a shared vocabulary. You can hold people accountable. I can disagree and commit to the highest guy in Amazon if that's powered by clear data from customers and I've got customer obsession on my side. And some people say that that's a testament to culture, whether you can disagree with other people and go against things when you're backed by these principles. A final thing that's different, I think, is if these values are really high level and fluffy, there's not a lot you can do with them and you cannot really use them. But a lot of these are very practical. So in a lot of day-to-day decisions or in day-to-day trade-offs, these things are used, or you think about it, oh, if I have to make this decision and I think about it from a customer obsession point of view or from a frugality point of view, like how would I act? And that drives a lot of behavior. So let's zoom into a few of them and then also look at some of the mechanisms or processes that are close to that. So one key thing is ownership. And what we're saying is leaders are owners. And by the way, they're called leadership principles. It doesn't mean it's only for the leaders in the business. Everyone in Amazon is seen as a leader in its own role or in its own domain. So they basically apply to anyone. So don't think it's just for like senior management or something like that. But the key thing for ownership is you never say that's not my job. You take ownership of what you're doing. And that is very applicable to the development environments as well and to operations. And the term DevOps right now is really big in the industry, but it's one of the things that got embraced by Amazon before the term was actually there in 2003, 2004-ish. And it was very much around this concept of what's referred to by Jeff Bezos as the two pizza teams. And some of you, I see some people nodding, so some of you heard about it. So there's this mindset that as soon as a team becomes so big that two pizzas are not enough to feed them at night when they work late, it gets bogged down in too much detail and it's broken up. So every team is, and it's interesting, right? We just saw that with Airbnb. no more than 10. You see it in Spotify where they call them squads, and there are also about 8 people, and you see that in Amazon as well. So very small teams, and all these teams are completely cross-functional, again, just like what we saw with Airbnb just now. So very much developers, designers, testers, all working together. So when you call up Amazon.com right now, you're actually invoking about 250 different services or features. Each of them have a team that is fully responsible for that, take full ownership end-to-end across the entire life cycle of such a thing. Two Pizza Team went mainstream when Dilbert had something to say about it, and I thought I'd share it. I love Dilbert. And I know we have a lot of engineers in the room, and I'm sorry, I cannot explain how cheese bread fits into all of this, but you might do your own homework. So that's one of the leadership principles and how we think about it from an organization. Another one is dive deep, and where leaders are expected to operate at all levels, at 50,000 feet, but also basically roll up your sleeves and get down and dirty with the detail. And how you see that in the organization is that we're an incredibly metrics-driven organization. And it's interesting if you now talk with startups and you look at their investor pitch decks or whatever, everything is around metrics and being able to quantify what you do and drive objectives towards specific metrics around traction or whatever. In Amazon, we have like weekly ops metrics meetings, and it's really packs and packs of metrics that describe the business. And every service team, and I just mentioned we have a lot of these service teams, all kind of like 2 Pizza Team sized, have a scorecard. And every graph or every metric that is customer impacting has a graph. And the graph is a line that we refer to sometimes as a fitness function. And whenever something crosses that line, there's a process that's triggered, which is called the correction of error process. And I think what's interesting there is, A, the attention to detail and diving deep, but also looking at data and at your customer, not just in terms of this has already impacted the customer, but also this might impact the customer, or it has impacted the customer and he hardly realized it. And there was a great example last year. There was this guy called TJ, and he wrote about it and it got published, that was looking, they were watching a movie on Amazon Instant Video. And in the beginning, there was a bit of a glitch. So we had to start the movie again, and worked fine. He watched the movie, enjoyed it, didn't think twice about it, no big deal. And then a few days later, he actually got an email from Amazon where, without him ever having filed a complaint or anything, he got an email saying, hey, we noticed that you experienced poor video playback. We're really sorry, and we basically give you your money back, even though you watched the full movie. And I think that really shows customer obsession, but it also shows that how the data that we had in the back got surfaced in one of these meetings potentially, and actually got used to give a good customer experience and actually delight the customer by doing this without him asking for it, right? And then lastly, customer obsession. When Jeff Bezos started Amazon, he basically set out from day one to build what he calls like the Earth's most customer-obsessed organization. And that drives a lot of the things that we're doing in Amazon. And one part that it drives is actually the product development process and the innovation process. And there's a lot of people, and Drew Houston, Dropbox is a good example, where he's actually saying that the key thing is to get stuff in the hand of your customers as quickly as you can. And it doesn't need to be code, it could be anything else. So with Dropbox, he's known for really driving virality and traction with a small little geeky video he did, and he promoted that on Hacker News, and a lot of hacker jokes in there, and you know, the rest of it is history. At Amazon, we don't do it with videos, but the first step is actually a pretty strange one as well. We write a press release. And we write a press release as if we sell it to the New York Times, which we don't. It's just internal. But it's very much to capture the customer perspective. So if you do that, and you really say, okay, if I were to build this product in 3 months or 5 months or 6 months when I release this, I want to be able to say this. I want to be able to say this about how I understand the customer, how we solve that problem. And I want to have like 2 or 3 quotes from customers that we want them to genuinely say about the product and why they love it in a few months from now. So it's really beginning with the end in mind. Now what you get and we then actually show that to internal stakeholders and sometimes to like friendly customers. And if people don't get excited, never mind, we don't write a single line of code, we don't build anything, we don't waste resources on it. But if people do get excited, you go to the next step. And the next step is actually interesting, like, because if you show this press release to people and they ask you a lot of difficult questions, that's actually a sign of interest. So the next step is actually to write a frequently asked questions. Think through all the questions that a customer might have if they were to buy this product or if we would have this product, right? And then third, we start finding the right primitives. Now, primitives is a bit of a difficult concept, but if you think about what I said about the architecture and how we do loose coupling and create everything in small components, and you do the same with organization and you build everything into small two-pizza teams, when you release a product, you also think about a primitive, which is the smallest piece of value that I can provide to your customers. And for those of you here that are familiar with Amazon Web Service, you can think about the EC2 API as a primitive for the compute services we offer, or the S3 API as the primitive for our storage capabilities. So once you've done that, it's only then that you start basically building the product and then launching it, and then it's all about iterating from there. And that iteration is pretty crucial. And we just mentioned Airbnb with the pull request, code review, driving continuous integration and so on to really increase the speed of deployments and so on. And that's very important at Amazon as well. And it's very much around this rate of experimentation. And Jeff Bezos has a point there which I share with you as well.
But successful invention, if you want to do a lot of that, you basically have to increase your rate of experimentation. And that you can think of as a process. How do you go about organizing your systems, your people, all of your assets, your own daily life and how you spend time? How do you organize those things to increase your rate of experimentation?
So if you think about the rate of experimentation, a lot of it's to do in terms of how much trials do you run, not just in your test and development environment, but even into production. And the speed of deployments at Amazon is pretty darn fast. This is a snapshot of May 2011, but in that month we release code into production every 11.6 seconds, which is very different than a lot of large organizations where it might be quarterly or twice a year or something like that. And it's not that is just test and development, it's really production, and it's not to a small subset. It's on average to about 10,000 virtual machines or instances or servers, if you like, sometimes to 30,000 at the same time. So that is rapid and a good example of how a lot of these components of the culture that we've talked about come together to allow that rate of experimentation and deployment. So I think in conclusion, you know, at Amazon we talk about this formula, but if you think about it outside of the Amazon context and you think about the things I spoke about with Payroll Hero as well and with Airbnb, when you think about startup DNA, think very, very much about your culture and what you are, and as a founder, what behaviors you show. It's not just what you say, it's the behaviors you show. It's then the people that you hire and bring into that. But then as you start growing your company, it's what do you do with your mechanisms, your processes, your organization and your architecture to really build that startup DNA and keep it as your skill, your business. So with that, thank you very much.